How did a king so profoundly unlikely, a man who began his life as the third son, a proverbial spare's spare, a footnote in the line of succession, and who spent decades as a boisterous, often mocked sailor duke, find himself in the precise, precarious position to save the entire British monarchy from total, violent revolution? This is the central, astonishing question of William IV's reign, a reign that marks the true, chaotic end of the 18th century and the fraught birth of the modern era. Before he was king, he was merely the Duke of Clarence, a man who had spent a full 20 years, the prime of his life, in a comfortable domestic though unmarried partnership with his mistress, the celebrated comic actress Dorothea Jordan. With her, he sired a sprawling brood of 10 illegitimate children, the Fitzclarences, raising them in a noisy, relatively normal approximation of family life at Bushy Park, far from the centers of power. His ascension to the throne was never part of any serious calculation. It was an accident of biology, tragedy, and the sheer reproductive failure of his entire generation of royals. Only when the crisis of royal succession became so dire, following the death of his niece-in-line, Princess Charlotte, did he reluctantly and cruelly cast off his long-term partner and dutifully marry a German, Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a woman chosen for her quiet nature and presumed fertility. William never expected to rule. He wasn't groomed for it. He wasn't educated for it, and frankly, few in the royal establishment believed he was remotely suited for it. But when his eldest brother, the extravagant, reclusive, and despised King George IV, died in 1830, without a legitimate heir, and his other older brother Frederick, Duke of York, had already predeceased him, also childless, the crown fell almost by default onto the head of this 64-year-old eccentric. He inherited not just a crown, but a nation simmering on the very brink of open insurrection, a populace disgusted by decades of grotesque royal excess, and a political system so archaic, corrupt, and broken that it was threatening to tear the entire country apart. Before we dive into the dramatic story of this accidental king and the constitutional firestorm he inherited, we have a small but important request. If you enjoy learning about the hidden figures and pivotal moments that truly shaped our world, please take a moment to support our channel. Hitting the like button is a simple, free way to tell the algorithm that this is content worth seeing, and it genuinely helps us reach a wider audience of history lovers. Please be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single one of our deep dive documentaries. And finally, if you find this story as fascinating as we do, please share it with a friend, a family member, or in any online community that appreciates real history, researched and told with the passion it deserves. Your support is the engine that makes these detailed productions possible, and we are profoundly grateful for it. Thank you. To truly understand William IV, one must first look at the man he was for the 64 years before he became king. Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence. He was, in almost every respect, the antithesis of a monarch in waiting. His father, King George III, had packed him off to the Royal Navy at the tender age of 13, partly to impose discipline and partly just to get him out of the way. The experience defined him utterly. He became Sailor Bill, a man more comfortable on the quarterdeck of a ship than in a royal drawing room, known for his loud, boisterous personality, his colorful and often profane language, and a complete lack of aristocratic polish. He served in the American War of Independence and was, for a time, stationed in New York, making him the only British monarch to have ever visited the United States. Though it was still a war zone at the time, he rose through the naval ranks. But his career was more marked by his enthusiastic embracing of the naval lifestyle, the drinking, the coarse humor, the camaraderie, the bluntness than by any particular strategic brilliance. For 2 decades, from 1791 to 1811, his life was defined not by royal duty, but by his relationship with Mrs. Dorothea Jordan. She was one of the most famous and beloved comic actresses of her day, a superstar of the stage. And he was, by all accounts, utterly devoted to her. They lived together openly at Bushy Park, raising their 10 children in a chaotic, affectionate, and decidedly unroyal household. This idyllic, if publicly scandalous, life came to an abrupt, brutal, and tragic end. The death of Princess Charlotte in 1817, the only legitimate child of William's eldest brother, George, triggered a full-blown succession crisis. The royal baby race was on a desperate, undignified scramble among the middle-aged, unmarried royal dukes to find legitimate wives and produce an heir. William, recognizing his new dynastic importance and the financial incentives that came with it, cruelly and unceremoniously dumped Dorothea, cutting her off. She died penniless, in debt, and alone in France just a few years later. A grim postscript to their 2 decades of partnership, he found his own bride, Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a quiet, pious, and kind-hearted woman half his age. Their marriage was by all accounts a surprisingly gentle and supportive one. But it was marked by its own deep personal tragedy. The 2 daughters she bore him both died in infancy, sealing the fate of his own direct line and ensuring the crown would eventually pass to his niece. William never expected to rule because the line of succession seemed robustly settled. Far ahead of him, his father, King George III, had many sons. The first in line was, of course, George, the Prince Regent, who would become King George IV. The second in line was Prince Frederick, the Duke of York, a man who was, for most of his life, seen as the more stable, sensible, and likely long-term heir after his debauched older brother. William was a distant, almost forgotten third. But the Hanoverian line, for all its fecundity in illegitimate children, was remarkably brittle in its legitimate branches. Frederick, the commander-in-chief of the army, died of dropsy in 1827, childless. Then, in 1830, the main event, King George IV, died. It is impossible to overstate the profound, almost universal relief and disgust that greeted his passing. George IV's reign had been a national embarrassment of staggering proportions. He was a man of aesthetic taste, but of zero moral compass. His life was defined by profligate spending, the onion-domed royal pavilion in Brighton being his most fantastical and bank-breaking folly, grotesque self-indulgence, scandalous affairs, and a disastrous publicly toxic marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, whom he tried and failed to divorce in a humiliating public trial. In his later years, he was a laudanum-addicted, morbidly obese recluse, hiding in Windsor Castle, who was openly despised by his people. When William, at the advanced age of 64, the oldest person to ever ascend the British throne at that time, inherited the crown, he also inherited this poisonous, bankrupt legacy. The nation was simmering with unrest from the swing riots in the countryside, where desperate, starving agricultural laborers burned hayricks and smashed new threshing machinery, to the new industrial centers in the north demanding with increasing menace some form of political representation. The crown itself was at its lowest ebb of popularity in centuries, and the new king, the eccentric Sailor Bill, seemed a flimsy, almost comical choice to steer the nation through the most dangerous storm it had faced since the 1600s, the greatest single crisis William inherited. The one that overshadowed everything else was not a foreign war or a financial collapse, but Parliament itself, the British system of government, lauded by its beneficiaries for its stability, was in fact ancient, sclerotic, and fundamentally, systemically corrupt. The Industrial Revolution had completely remade the map of Britain, forging a new world of steam, iron, and factories, but the electoral map remained stuck in the Middle Ages. Entire new, vast industrial cities, the new economic engines of the world, like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Sheffield, had exploded in population, packed with tens of thousands of people, revolutionary new industries, and immense wealth. Yet they had no members of Parliament. Zero. The voices of these new, powerful industrial and middle classes were completely silenced. Meanwhile, tiny, deserted hamlets, often with only a handful of voters, still elected to MPs apiece. These were the infamous rotten boroughs, places that were often nothing more than a legal fiction. Old Sarum, near Salisbury, was the most notorious example. It was literally just a green hill, the site of a long-abandoned medieval city, with precisely 7 voters, all of whom were controlled by the local landowner. Dunwich on the Suffolk coast had famously fallen into the North Sea centuries prior, but was still technically represented by 2 MPs. These pocket boroughs were owned outright by wealthy aristocrats, who would simply appoint their sons, their friends, their sycophants, or the highest bidder to the seat. The system gave the landed aristocracy, and specifically the members of the House of Lords, total, iron-fisted control over the supposedly representative House of Commons. This wasn't just a political quirk, it was an outrageous, indefensible system of old corruption that denied the new, powerful middle classes any say in government and left the vast, unrepresented working classes completely disenfranchised, desperate, and increasingly revolutionary. The people, suffocating under this broken system, demanded change. This demand was not new, but by 1830 it had reached a terrifying fever pitch. Electrified by shocking news from across the English Channel, the July Revolution in France had just successfully toppled their own reactionary King Charles X in a matter of days, proving that revolution was not some historical artifact from the 1790s, but a present, immediate, and terrifyingly effective possibility. The British people were reading the news from Paris, and they were inspired. This wave of revolutionary fervor shattered the long-standing, inflexible Tory government, led by the military hero, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington, a man of the 18th century, famously and disastrously declared in Parliament that the current system of representation was perfect and that he would countenance no change whatsoever. His government, facing national outrage, collapsed almost overnight. Into the breach stepped the Whig Party, led by the aristocratic but deeply pragmatic Earl Grey. The Whigs, having been out of power for most of the last 50 years, rode a tidal wave of public opinion into power on a single, unifying, non-negotiable promise: parliamentary reform. Grey and his allies were not, by any stretch of the imagination, firebrand radicals. They were, for the most part, immensely wealthy landowners themselves, who looked at the fires in France with as much horror as the Tories. But they were also realists. They looked at the burning herricks of the swing riots in their own counties. They saw the mass organized protests in the new cities, and they looked at the toppled throne in Paris, and they came to a single cold, self-interested conclusion: the only way to prevent a violent, bloody, and property-destroying revolution from below was to strategically concede a managed reform from above. Their motto was effectively reform, that we may preserve. It was a calculated, high-stakes gamble to save their own world by letting just enough steam out of the kettle to prevent it from exploding entirely. King William IV was a conservative at heart, and he was now trapped in a constitutional nightmare. By conviction and temperament, he was an old Tory. He had spent his entire life as a naval officer, a man who believed in discipline, hierarchy, tradition, and the established order of the king's government. As the Duke of Clarence, he had sat in the House of Lords, and had, on occasion, even spoken against the very idea of parliamentary reform, which he saw as a dangerous, Jacobin idea. He personally and profoundly distrusted this drastic reform, as he called it, believing it was the first step on a slippery slope that would unravel the entire British Constitution, empower the mob, a word used with genuine fear, and ultimately lead to the destruction of the monarchy itself, just as it had in France. But William was also something his brother George IV had never been: a pragmatist and, in his own eccentric way, a man of the people. He was not a recluse. He walked the streets, he read the reports, and he could sense the volcanic, ungovernable anger in the nation. He was, above all, terrified of a full-blown revolution. He did not want to be the British Charles X, forced to flee his own kingdom, and so he found himself in an agonizing, impossible position, caught between his own deeply held beliefs and the terrifying reality that the survival of his crown might depend on him personally sanctioning the very bill he despised. He was trapped between his reactionary court and his unyieldingly reformist prime minister. The crisis exploded in 1831, pushing the nation to the absolute brink of civil war. The Whigs, led by Earl Grey, introduced their reform bill in the House of Commons. In a moment of high drama, it passed by a single, solitary, dramatic vote. Grey, seizing the moment, immediately advised the king to dissolve Parliament and call a new election, turning that vote into a national referendum on one single issue, the bill, the whole bill, and nothing but the bill. The Whigs won a landslide majority, a clear, unambiguous mandate from the people. The newly elected Commons easily passed a second reform bill in September 1831. The battle was won, or so it seemed. But the bill then had to pass the House of Lords, the unelected hereditary chamber filled with hundreds of aristocrats and bishops who saw this bill as a direct existential assault on their power, their property, and their very existence. They flatly, arrogantly, and contemptuously rejected it. The nation erupted in an instant. The Great Reform riots were the most significant wave of public violence in Britain in over 100 years. In Bristol, the city was seized by a mob for 3 days. The Bishop's Palace, the Mansion House, and the city's jails were all looted and burned to the ground, with hundreds killed in the chaos. In Nottingham, rioters, incensed at the anti-reform Duke of Newcastle, burned his Nottingham Castle to a blackened shell. In Derby, the town jail was stormed and its prisoners freed. Troops were deployed across the country. Political unions, numbering in the tens of thousands, began to arm themselves and drill openly. Britain was on the razor's edge of a full-scale, organized insurrection, with the country in flames, the economy grinding to a halt, and the Lords intransigently blocking the will of the people and the Commons. Earl Grey saw only one path forward, and it was a constitutional nuclear option. He went to King William and played his final, desperate card. He asked the king to use his ancient royal prerogative as the fount of honor to create at least 50, and perhaps as many as 80 new Whig peers, instantly flooding the House of Lords with pro-reform votes. This was, as the script rightly notes, constitutional sabotage. It was a plan to use one ancient part of the Constitution, the king's power to create peers, to permanently break another, the Lords' independence, all to force the passage of a single bill. It was a revolutionary act in itself, one that would forever change the balance of power between the two houses and effectively end the Lords as a co-equal chamber. William was horrified. This was exactly the kind of drastic meddling he feared, a complete subversion of the ancient order. He refused. Grey and his entire cabinet, seeing no other option, immediately resigned, leaving the king with no government. This triggered the days of May in 1832, a period of unparalleled tension. William desperately tried to install a hard-line Tory government led by the Duke of Wellington. The public response was immediate and catastrophic. A coordinated run on the banks to stop the Duke. Go for gold, read the placards, a widespread, organized tax revolt and mass, organized protests. The country was ungovernable. Wellington, the great soldier, recognized that he couldn't rule by military force alone against the will of the nation. He failed, humiliating the king and proving, once and for all, that only Earl Grey could lead. This was William's moment of truth, the pivot upon which his entire reign and perhaps the future of the monarchy would turn. Beaten, humiliated, and terrified, he was forced to recall Earl Grey. Grey returned to power with one non-negotiable condition. The king must now promise, in writing, to create the peers if the Lords resisted again. William, after intense, agonizing hesitation, and reportedly under great pressure from his fiercely anti-reform wife, Queen Adelaide, who feared for his crown, finally relented. He gave Grey his sacred, written pledge. The game was over. The king's private secretary was dispatched to the die-hard Tory peers, led by the Duke of Wellington, with a simple, devastating message: His Majesty has consented. If you vote against this bill and defeat it, 50 new Whig peers will be in this chamber by tomorrow, and your power, your independence, and your prestige will be diluted to nothing, forever. The threat was enough. It was a perfect checkmate. Knowing they were beaten, and choosing the lesser of two evils, accepting this one bill to save the integrity of their house from being flooded, Wellington and the other diehards signaled their defeat. They did not vote for the bill. In a final, symbolic act of aristocratic protest, they simply abstained and left the chamber. The Great Reform Act of 1832, the most significant piece of legislation in 19th century British history, passed the House of Lords and became law. Revolution was averted, and William, ironically, was praised by the public as the reformer king, the man who had bent his own will to save his nation. The newly reformed parliament, now with representatives from the new industrial cities and a powerful, energetic mandate for change, immediately set to work, tackling some of the most monumental moral and social issues of the day. The very first major act of this new political era, in 1833, was one of global significance, the Slavery Abolition Act. The abolitionist movement, led by figures like William Wilberforce for decades, had already succeeded in getting the horrific transatlantic slave trade banned in 1807. However, that act did not free a single person who was already enslaved in the British colonies. The 1833 Act was the final, difficult, and long overdue step. It formally abolished the institution of slavery itself across most of the vast British Empire, most notably in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, etc., South Africa, and Canada. This single law granted, in name, freedom to more than 800,000 enslaved people. But this moral victory, one of the greatest of the 19th century, came at a deeply sordid and controversial price. To overcome the immense political and financial power of the West India lobby, the slave-owning political bloc that had for decades blocked reform, the government was forced to offer a massive compensation package not to the enslaved people who had lost their lives, families, and freedom, but to the slave owners for the loss of their property. The government took out a colossal loan of £20 million, a sum so vast it represented 40% of the government's entire national budget for the year, the modern equivalent of tens, if not hundreds, of billions of pounds to pay off the slave owners. It was a landmark moment for human freedom, but one built on a morally compromised and staggering financial bribe, the final payment of which was not settled by British taxpayers until 2015. That same year, 1833, the reformed parliament turned its attention from the sugar cane fields of the Caribbean to the dark, satanic mills of its own industrial heartland. The 1833 Factory Act was the first meaningful, and more importantly, enforceable, attempt by any government to regulate the horrors of industrial child labor. The Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of children, in textile mills especially. Children as young as 5 or 6 were prized for their small size and nimble fingers able to crawl under active dangerous machinery to retrieve broken threads. They commonly worked 12, 14, or even 16-hour days, breathing in lung-destroying cotton dust and facing the constant threat of being maimed, scalped, or killed by the unfenced, relentless machines. The act was driven by evangelical reformers like Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury. While timid by modern standards, it was revolutionary for its time. It banned the employment of children under the age of 9 from working in textile mills. It limited the workday for children aged 9 to 13 to only 8 hours, and for those aged 14 to 18 to 12 hours. It also banned all-night work for children. Perhaps most importantly, the act was not just a suggestion. It established a professional body of salaried factory inspectors, empowered by the state to enter the mills and enforce the law, a crucial first step in state regulation. It was a small, incremental move, but it established the radical principle that the state had a right and a duty to intervene in the free market to protect the most vulnerable in society. Not all reforms were popular or even humane. In fact, one of the most significant acts of this parliament was, and remains, one of the most deeply controversial and hated pieces of legislation in British history, the 1830 for Poor Law Amendment Act. The old poor law system, which dated back to Elizabethan times, was based on outdoor relief, essentially direct parish aid, food, money, or clothing given to the poor in their own homes. The system was decried by New Wave utilitarian thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Malthus, and the rising middle class as wildly expensive, inefficient, and worst of all, encouraging idleness, vice, and large families among the poor, paying them to be lazy. The new poor law of 1834 was a cold, calculated, and deliberately brutal solution based on a rigid, pseudoscientific ideology. It abolished outdoor relief for able-bodied men and their families. From now on, the only way to receive any public aid was to enter the workhouse. These new workhouses were not charities. They were deliberately designed to be prisons for the poor. The core principle was less eligibility, conditions inside the workhouse had to be, by law, more terrifying and unpleasant than the very worst, lowest paying, most miserable job outside it. They were built, explicitly, to deter applications. Families were torn apart upon entry. Husbands, wives, and children were segregated into different wings and often never saw each other again. The food was thin, tasteless, and minimal gruel. The work was pointless and degrading, such as breaking stones for hours on end or picking oakum, unraveling old, tarred ropes. These pauper Bastilles, as they were known, cast a shadow of terror over the working class. For the rest of an entire century, and the world of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist Asking for More was not a caricature, it was a direct, searing critique of this very law. In 1834, with the great reforms good and bad now passing into law, William made history one last time, in a final, futile attempt to assert the royal power he felt slipping away. He had only ever tolerated his Whig government, which had forced the Reform Act upon him. After Earl Grey retired, he was succeeded by Lord Melbourne. William, who was personally and politically conservative, found himself increasingly at odds with Melbourne's Whig policies, particularly those concerning reforms to the Church of Ireland, which he saw as an attack on the established religion. Believing the government was in a moment of weakness, William did something no monarch had done in decades. He used his royal prerogative to dismiss his prime minister. He fired Lord Melbourne. Even though Melbourne still commanded a majority in the House of Commons, William then invited the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel, to form a new government. This was a direct, personal intervention, a throwback to the days of his father, George III, a king trying to choose his own government, rather than accept the one chosen by Parliament. But it was 1834, not 1784. The world had changed, and the very Reform Act William had passed had made the House of Commons, not the king, the center of gravity. Peel, a pragmatist, knew he couldn't govern without a majority. He called a general election, which the Whigs led by the martyred Lord Melbourne promptly won. Returning to power with more seats, William was utterly, publicly humiliated, forced to accept Melbourne back as his prime minister. This incident, a constitutional crisis in miniature, was a landmark. It proved definitively that the monarch's personal power to hire and fire governments was gone. William IV would be the very last British monarch ever to dismiss a prime minister who held the confidence of the House of Commons, setting the final precedent that true power now rested with Parliament. Unlike his grotesquely unpopular and reclusive brother, George IV, William IV was, to the surprise of many, genuinely and widely popular with the common people. He was seen as approachable, eccentric, and refreshingly down-to-earth. The public, weary of the insulated arrogance and decadent scandals of the Regency, found William's unpolished, naval officer bluntness to be a virtue. He was dubbed Sailor Bill or the Sailor King, and he leaned into the persona. He despised the stuffy, formal court protocol his brother had loved. He would often walk alone or with a single, small-manned umbrella, which he was known for brandishing through the streets of London and Brighton, greeting people he met, patting children on the head, and asking tradesmen how their day was going, much to the horror of his own courtiers and security. Anecdotes, true or not, spread like wildfire about him, offering lifts in the royal carriage to bewildered citizens caught in the rain or spitting out of the window of his carriage like a common sailor. His court was informal. His language was often salty. He was prone to exclaiming, "My God," at official functions, and his general demeanor was that of an accessible, if slightly bumbling, country gentleman. This new, informal, and visible style of monarchy did wonders to restore the public's faith in the institution. He and his famously pious and charitable wife, Queen Adelaide, who was beloved in her own right for her modesty and good works, single-handedly detoxified the brand of the monarchy. They made the crown seem human, decent, and patriotic again, repairing the immense damage done by his predecessor and, crucially, making the institution safe for his successor. William IV died in 1837, just 7 years after taking the throne. His health, robust for much of his life, finally failed him in his final year. He died of heart failure at Windsor Castle, with his beloved wife, Queen Adelaide, by his side. His death brought the central tragedy of his personal life into sharp constitutional focus. Despite his vast illegitimate family, the Fitzclarences, and his deep, genuine affection for his wife, Queen Adelaide, his legitimate line had failed. The two daughters they had together, Princess Charlotte and Princess Elizabeth, had both died in infancy, one just hours after birth, the other at only 3 months old. This personal heartbreak for William and Adelaide meant that the crown would not pass to his own child. According to the laws of succession, it had to go to the next in line, the eldest child of his next youngest brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who had also died years earlier. That child was a quiet, sheltered, 18-year-old girl who had been raised in relative seclusion at Kensington Palace, Princess Alexandrina Victoria. In the early, pre-dawn hours of June 20, 1837, the Lord Chamberlain and the Archbishop of Canterbury traveled to the palace, woke the young princess from her bed, and informed her that her uncle, the king, was dead. Her first words as she stood before them, still in her nightgown, were reportedly, "I will be good." The crown passed peacefully, without contest, to a teenage girl, a peaceful transition that would have been utterly unthinkable just 7 years prior, before her uncle's turbulent reign had navigated the storm. His chaotic short and accidental 7-year reign had served as the most crucial and violent bridge in modern British history, closing the door firmly and finally on the chaotic, scandalous Georgian era and ushering in the stable new and dramatically different Victorian age.